The fluorescent lights of Metro General Hospital cast harsh shadows as Dr. Sarah Chen hurried through the sliding doors, her pregnant belly leading the way. The familiar antiseptic smell hit her nostrils as she navigated the busy corridor, dodging gurneys and nodding to familiar faces. Another night shift in the emergency department, the kind of shift she'd grown to love over the years, even if her swollen ankles protested more these days. Dr. Chen, a nurse, called out, waving a clipboard. "Your husband called," said something about the nursery paint samples. Sarah smiled, touching her 7-month bump instinctively. David, ever the perfectionist, had probably spent the entire evening comparing different shades of mint green. "Tell him I'll call during my break," she replied, pulling her dark hair into a tight bun as she headed for the locker room. As she changed into her scrubs, her reflection caught her eye. The woman staring back at her was different from the one 5 years ago, stronger, wiser, with laugh lines around her eyes that hadn't been there before. Success had come at a price, but it had come nevertheless. 5 years. Sometimes it felt like yesterday when she'd been a different Sarah, living what she thought was a perfect life with Marcus. Their apartment overlooking the park, Sunday brunches at that little cafe on 7th Street, plans for a future that seemed as solid as the diamond ring on her finger. She'd been younger then, more naive, believing in forever promises and happy endings. Until that rainy Tuesday when she'd come home early from her residency, excited to share the news of her pregnancy, only to find Marcus with another woman. The memory still stung, but like an old scar rather than an open wound. The miscarriage that followed nearly broke her, but it hadn't. Instead, it had forged her into something stronger. Now, at 34, she was one of the youngest leading transplant surgeons on the East Coast. Her research on living donor procedures had been published in top medical journals, and her success rates spoke for themselves. The ring on her finger now belonged to David, a pediatric oncologist who'd shown her that love could be steady and true, without grand gestures or empty promises. Sarah smoothed her scrub top over her prominent belly, feeling a flutter of movement within. This pregnancy was different, planned, celebrated, supported by a man who'd proven his devotion in 1,000 small ways. David had painted the nursery 3 different times already, insisting that their daughter deserved the perfect shade of green. "Dr. Chen to the ER stat. Dr. Chen to the ER." The overhead speaker crackled to life, pulling her from her reverie. She grabbed her stethoscope, checked her pager, and headed out. Whatever emergency awaited her, she was ready. She'd learned the hard way that life's greatest challenges often came disguised as its greatest opportunities. Tonight would be no different, or so she thought, as she made her way to what would become the most difficult shift of her career. Multiple organ failure, suspected alcoholic hepatitis, Dr. Rodriguez reported as Sarah pushed through the trauma bay doors. BPs dropping, severe jaundice, mental status declining rapidly. The patient lay motionless on the gurney, skin a sickly yellow in the harsh emergency room lights. His dark hair was matted with sweat, his breathing labored. Something about his profile tugged at Sarah's memory, but she pushed the thought aside, focusing on the immediate crisis. "Labs," she demanded, pulling on her gloves. "Liver enzymes through the roof. Cogs are shot. We're typing and crossing for blood products now." Sarah leaned over to assess the patient's pupils, and her world stopped. Through the jaundice and the sickness, through 5 years of memories she'd tried to bury, she knew that face. Marcus. Her hands froze mid-examination. The room seemed to tilt sideways, the steady beep of monitors becoming distant and hollow. It wasn't possible. It couldn't be. Dr. Chen Rodriguez's voice snapped her back. "Should we call for emergency dialysis?" Sarah swallowed hard, professionalism wrestling with the storm of emotions threatening to overwhelm her. "Yes, and get me a full tox screen, viral hepatitis panel, and call CT for an urgent triple-phase liver study." The next hour passed in a blur of procedures and tests. Sarah moved on autopilot, her training taking over while her mind raced. Marcus had always been a drinker, social at first, then gradually more. She'd asked him to cut back, seeing where it was heading. He'd promised he would, just like he'd promised forever. Dr. Chen, the transplant coordinator, Lisa, appeared at her elbow with a tablet. "Labs are back, and I've pulled his medical history. It's not good." Sarah scanned the results, her medical knowledge translating the numbers into a grim reality. His liver was failing catastrophically, poisoned by years of alcohol abuse. Without a transplant, he had days, maybe hours. "I've already started the UNO's listing process," Lisa continued, "but given his condition, he won't survive long enough for a deceased donor. He needs a living donor, and soon." "Family?" Sarah asked, her voice steadier than she felt. "Parents deceased. No siblings. We're running compatibility tests on his emergency contacts now," but Lisa hesitated, tapping something on her tablet. "There's already a match in our database." Sarah knew before Lisa turned the screen toward her. She'd been typed years ago, part of the hospital's living donor registry. The numbers stared back at her, a perfect match. "It's you, Dr. Chen. You're his only viable option right now." The irony was almost too much to bear. 5 years ago, she'd have given him anything: her love, her future, her whole heart. Now he needed part of her liver, and she was 7 months pregnant with another man's child. Marcus stirred on the bed, his eyes fluttering open. For a moment, clarity seemed to break through his confusion. His cracked lips moved, forming her name. "Sarah." She stepped back, one hand protectively covering her belly. "Page Dr. Williams to take over," she told Rodriguez. "I need to make some calls." In the hallway, Sarah leaned against the wall, taking deep breaths. Her baby kicked, a reminder of everything she had to lose. A living donor transplant was risky enough; doing one while pregnant was almost unheard of. Even if she wanted to help, and she wasn't sure she did, could she justify risking her baby's life to save the man who'd abandoned her? Her phone buzzed a text from David. "Hope your shift is going okay. Nursery samples narrowed down to 2 shades. Love you both." Sarah closed her eyes, tears threatening to spill. How could she tell her husband that her ex-fiancé's life now depended on her willingness to risk everything they'd built together? How could she make this impossible choice? The overhead speaker crackled again. "Code blue, Air Bay 3. Code blue, Air Bay 3. Marcus's Bay." Sarah sat in the dark of her office, the code team still working on Marcus in the hour. She'd excused herself a conflict of interest, she'd said. No one questioned it. Now, alone with her thoughts, the memories she'd kept locked away for 5 years came flooding back. They'd met during her first year of residency. Marcus had been the charming pharmaceutical rep who always brought coffee for the entire staff. He'd pursued her for weeks, leaving sticky notes on her locker with terrible medical puns. When she finally agreed to a date, he took her to the symphony, knowing she'd played cello in college. That was Marcus when he got something right. He got it perfectly right. Their romance had been a whirlwind. Within 6 months, they were living together. At 1 year, he proposed at that same symphony hall during a performance of Dvorak, her favorite composer. She'd never felt more certain of anything than when she'd said yes. "We'll have a whole baseball team of kids," he'd joke, spinning her around their kitchen. All of them musical prodigies, of course. She'd laugh, imagining little girls with his smile and boys with his dark curls. They'd picked out names, painted a spare room pale yellow, just in case. The memory shifted to that rainy Tuesday. She'd been nauseous all week, a good kind of nauseous. The pregnancy test had shown positive that morning, and she couldn't wait to tell him. She'd even bought a tiny pair of ballet shoes, a nod to his joke about musical prodigies. But when she'd opened their apartment door, she'd found him on their couch with her. Rebecca, his pharmaceutical company's regional manager. They hadn't even heard Sarah come in, too lost in each other to notice her standing there, the tiny ballet shoes slipping from her numb fingers. "It's been going on 6 months," he'd admitted later, after Rebecca had hurriedly left. "I'm sorry, Sarah. I'm not ready for forever. Not with anyone." She hadn't told him about the pregnancy. What was the point? He'd made his choice. She'd packed her bags that night, gone to stay with her sister. The cramp started 3 days later. By the time she made it to the ER, she was already losing the baby. Her colleagues had been kind, covering her shifts while she recovered. That's when she'd met David. He wasn't trying to date her, he was just the kind pediatric oncologist who brought her tea during long nights on call, who listened without judgment when she needed to talk. "You know what I love about kids with cancer," he'd said one night, after a particularly difficult case. "They teach us that healing isn't linear. Some days are better than others, and that's okay." It became their thing, sharing quiet moments between cases. He'd tell her about his patients, she'd tell him about her research. Somewhere between the cafeteria coffee and midnight consultations, she'd started to smile again. to hope again. Boy. Their first real date wasn't until a year after Marcus, when she finally felt ready. David had taken her bowling, of all things. He was terrible at it, but he'd made her laugh more that night than she had in months. "I'm not looking for perfect," he'd told her, after knocking down exactly one pin. "I'm looking for real." Through hospital gossip and mutual acquaintances, she'd heard about Marcus's decline. The drinking had gotten worse after their breakup. He'd lost his job at the pharmaceutical company, burned through relationships, moved in with his parents until they passed away. She'd pushed the news aside, focused on building her new life. David proposed 2 years ago, on a regular Tuesday morning over burnt toast and coffee. No symphony, no grand gestures. Just a simple question and a promise to face whatever came together. When they decided to try for a baby, they'd approached it like the doctors. They were practical, prepared for all possibilities. Sarah had been terrified of another loss, but David had held her through every fear, every doctor's appointment, every milestone. Now, touching her pregnant belly in the darkness of her office, Sarah felt her baby move. A strong kick, just like the one she'd felt that morning 5 years ago, before everything fell apart. The pain of that loss had shaped her, changed her, but it hadn't defined her. Her office phone lit up the ER. Marcus was stabilized for now. The code team had brought him back, but his condition was deteriorating rapidly. They needed a decision about the transplant evaluation. Sarah's computer screen glowed to life as she reached for her mouse. She pulled up Marcus's complete medical history, a courtesy exchange from his previous hospitals. The records told a story of progressive destruction, multiple admissions for alcohol poisoning, failed rehab attempts, a pattern of leaving against medical advice. His last admission had been 2 months ago. Another hospital, another promise to get clean. A soft knock at her door startled her. David stood there, still in his scrubs from his own shift at the children's hospital across town. "They called me," he said simply. "Thought you might need someone to talk to." Sarah felt the tears finally come as he wrapped his arms around her. Their baby kicked again, strong and insistent, caught between them. "He's dying," she whispered into David's chest, "and I'm the only one who can save him." David's hand found her belly, protective and gentle. "Whatever you decide," he said softly, "we'll face it together. Just like always." In the distance, another code was called. The hospital ethics committee convened at dawn, their faces grave in the fluorescent light of the conference room. Sarah sat between David and her department chief, Dr. Torres, her hands folded protectively over her belly. Across the table, Marcus's current girlfriend, Emma, dabbed at her eyes with a crumpled tissue. "Let's review the facts, Dr. Harrison," the committee chair began. "We have a 40-year-old male with acute liver failure requiring immediate transplantation. The only compatible living donor currently available is Dr. Chen, who is 7 months pregnant. Am I missing anything?" "Yes," Dr. Torres interjected. "The fact that performing a living donor transplant on a pregnant surgeon is not just ethically complex, it's professionally reckless. We'd be risking 3 lives: Sarah's, her baby's, and the patient's." Sarah watched Emma flinch at the word patient to her. Marcus wasn't just a medical case. Sarah understood that all too well. There are studies, Sarah found herself saying, her doctor's instincts overriding her personal turmoil. Living donor transplants during pregnancy, rare but not unprecedented. The risks increase after 30 weeks. I'm at 28. David's hand tightened around hers. They'd been up all night discussing this. He hadn't tried to influence her decision, but his fears were written clearly on his face. "Even if, and this is a big if we proceed," Dr. Harrison continued, "there's the question of the patient's history. Multiple failed rehabilitation attempts, continued alcohol use despite medical advice. The transplant committee would need significant assurance of compliance." Emma stood up suddenly, her chair scraping against the floor. "He's different now. He's been sober for 2 months. He's trying. He needs a chance." 2 months. Sarah almost laughed. 2 months of sobriety against 5 years of destruction. But wasn't that how recovery worked? 1 day at a time, 1 chance at a time. Dr. Chen Harrison's voice softened. "No one would blame you for declining. There are professional and personal considerations here that go well beyond normal medical ethics." Sarah closed her eyes, remembering yesterday's ultrasound. Their daughter, strong and healthy, sucking her thumb on the screen. David had teared up, just like he did at every appointment. They'd finally settled on a name, Hope. "I need to see him," Sarah said suddenly. "Before I decide, I need to talk to him." The committee exchanged glances. Dr. Torres spoke first. "He's been more lucid this morning." That might be possible. In Marcus's ICU room, the machines beeped steadily. He looked smaller somehow, swallowed up by tubes and wires. His eyes fluttered open as she approached. "Sarah," his voice was barely a whisper. "They told me, but I didn't believe." "Don't talk," she said automatically, checking his monitors. "Old habits." "Your baby," he managed. "I saw. You look happy." A lump formed in her throat. "I am happy." Good. His eyes closed briefly. "You deserve, I'm sorry. For everything. That day, the baby." Sarah froze. "You knew." Found the shoes. After you left, tears slid down his jaundiced cheeks. "Been carrying that all these years. Couldn't face it. Couldn't face anything." Outside the ICU, Sarah found her colleagues waiting. Dr. Rodriguez, who'd covered her shifts during her miscarriage. Nurse Chen, no relation, who'd held her hand through countless procedures. Dr. Patel, who'd mentored her through her transplant specialization. "Whatever you decide," Patel said gently, "we'll support you. But Sarah, you're not just a doctor here. You're not just his ex-fiancée. You're a mother now, or about to be. That has to come first." Back in her office, David sat with her as she reviewed the latest research papers. Risk statistics jumped off the pages: hemorrhage, preterm labor, organ rejection. "I keep thinking," David said quietly, "about what you always tell your transplant patients. About how the decision to donate has to come from a place of strength, not guilt." "This isn't guilt," Sarah replied, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. "This is, I don't know what this is." Her phone buzzed. A text from Emma. "I know I have no right to ask anything of you, but he's not the same person who hurt you. He talks about it sometimes. When he's trying to stay sober. About how losing you made him realize what he'd thrown away. He doesn't expect forgiveness. He just wants to live long enough to do better." Sarah's daughter kicked, a strong flutter under her ribs, the same spot where they'd need to make the incision if she agreed to the transplant. "You know what the worst part is," she told David. 5 years ago, I would have done anything to save our relationship, to save our baby. I didn't get that choice then, but now I have a choice. And I don't know if that makes it better or worse." Dr. Harrison's words echoed in her mind. "No one would blame you for declining." But Sarah knew that wasn't true. She would blame herself, not for Marcus's sake, but for her own. For the doctor she'd become, the healer she'd trained to be, the mother she was about to be. What lesson would she be teaching her daughter about forgiveness, about compassion, about the value of life, all life, even the lives that had hurt you? The ethics committee was reconvening in an hour. They needed her decision. "David," she whispered, "I need you to tell me honestly. If I do this, if I try to save him, will you still look at me the same way?" His answer would determine everything. The hospital chapel was empty at midnight, moonlight filtering through the stained glass windows. Sarah sat in the last pew, not praying exactly, but searching for something: clarity, courage, peace. David's words from earlier echoed in her mind. "I fell in love with your compassion first. Whatever you choose, that won't change." Dr. Patel found her there, 2 cups of chamomile tea in hand. Her mentor settled beside her, the wooden pew creaking softly. "I delivered my first baby during my residency in Mumbai," Patel said, passing Sarah a cup. "The mother had preeclampsia. We nearly lost them both. I was terrified, but the attending told me something I've never forgotten in medicine. We don't get to choose our moments of courage." Sarah wrapped her hands around the warm cup. "This feels less like courage and more like madness." "Is it?" Patel asked softly. "You've spent your career saving lives. Why is this different?" "Because it's him. Because it's personal. Everything in medicine is personal, Sarah. We just pretend it isn't." Patel paused, studying her former student's face. "Do you remember what you told me when you chose transplant surgery as your specialty?" Sarah smiled faintly. "That I wanted to give people second chances." "No." Patel touched her arm. "You said you wanted to show people that their worst day doesn't have to be their last day, that everyone deserves a chance to write a different ending." The baby kicked, as if in agreement. Sarah pressed a hand to her side, feeling the movement beneath her scrubs. "I need to see him again," she said suddenly. In the ICU, Marcus was awake, his eyes clearer than they'd been all day. Emma had gone home to rest, leaving him alone with his thoughts and his regrets. "I didn't expect to see you again," he said as Sarah checked his vitals, a habit she couldn't break. "I'm still deciding," she replied. I know he tried to shift position, wincing. "Sarah, that day. When I left, I was scared. Not of commitment, like I said. Of failing. Of not being enough. You were this brilliant doctor, saving lives, and I was just me." "You were enough," Sarah said quietly. "You just didn't believe it." "The drinking got worse after I found those baby shoes. I'd ruined everything. Perfect Sarah Chen, who deserved so much better." His voice cracked. "Look at you now. Successful, happy. About to be a mother. I was right about one thing: you deserve better." Sarah watched his monitors beeping steadily. Such a simple sound, marking the difference between life and death. How many times had she heard it in this hospital? How many lives had slipped away or been saved to that rhythm? "I'm not perfect, Marcus. I never was. And this baby," she touched her belly. "She won't be perfect either. But she'll know something I didn't back then: that love isn't about deserving. It's about choosing. Every day we choose who we want to be, what kind of world we want to live in." Marcus's eyes filled with tears. "You don't owe me anything." "No, I don't," Sarah stood, decision crystallizing in her mind like morning frost. "But I owe something to myself. To the doctor I am, to the mother I'm going to be. And maybe my daughter needs to learn that forgiveness isn't about erasing the past. It's about making room for a different future." She turned to leave, then paused at the door. "The transplant committee meets at 9. If you're serious about that different future, prove it. Not to me, to yourself." As she walked back to her office, Sarah felt lighter somehow. Not at peace exactly, but certain. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, its own fears. But tonight, in choosing to save a life, even his life, she was saving something in herself too. Her daughter kicked again, strong and sure, like a second heartbeat under her own. Tomorrow, they would face whatever came together, this tiny family of hers, teaching each other about courage, forgiveness, and the countless ways we save each other, day after day after day. The transplant committee room fell silent as Sarah delivered her conditions. "I'll do it," she said, her voice steady. "But there are terms. First, you enter rehab immediately after recovery, a full-year program, not just 90 days. Second, you agree to weekly drug and alcohol testing for the next 5 years. Third, you work with the hospital's addiction counseling program to help others once you're stable." She paused, meeting Marcus's eyes. "This is your last chance. Make it count." Dr. Torres outlined the risks one final time for the record: potential hemorrhage, premature labor, organ rejection. David squeezed Sarah's hand as she signed the consent forms, his wedding ring cool against her fingers. The surgery was scheduled for dawn, the safest time for both living donor procedures and pregnant patients, according to the latest research. Sarah spent her last hours before the operation in pre-op, surrounded by her team. Dr. Patel would be performing her part of the surgery, while Dr. Torres handled Marcus's transplant. Remember, Patel said during the final review, "At the first sign of fetal distress, we abort the procedure. Your baby comes first." Sarah nodded, already feeling the sedation beginning to take effect. The last thing she saw was David in his scrubs, mouthing "I love you" as they wheeled her into the operating room. She dreamed of ballet shoes. The first complication came 2 hours into the surgery. Sarah's blood pressure dropped suddenly, setting off a cascade of alarms. "Baby's heart rate is declining," the obstetrics monitor called out. Patel's voice cut through the chaos. "Push 1 unit of packed cells and get me better visualization of this bleeding." David, watching from the observation room, pressed his hand against the glass. In the adjacent operating room, Dr. Torres was already beginning Marcus's procedure, unaware of the crisis unfolding next door. BP stabilizing, a nurse announced. Fetal heart rate returning to normal. But the second crisis came during the transfer. As they moved the donated liver section to Marcus's oar, his body began rejecting it almost immediately. "He's crashing," Torres barked. "Get me the anti-rejection protocol, stat." Hours ticked by. In the recovery room, Sarah floated in and out of consciousness, one hand protectively curved around her belly. David never left her side, watching both her monitors and the updates from Marcus's surgery. It was nearly midnight when Dr. Torres appeared, looking exhausted but satisfied. Both procedures were successful, he announced. The transplanted section is functioning, and your labs are stable, Sarah. But what David asked. The strain on her body was significant. She'll need complete bed rest for the remainder of the pregnancy. No more surgeries, no hospital shifts, and we'll need to monitor the baby carefully for any delayed effects. Sarah nodded, still groggy. Marcus, stable. The anti-rejection medications are working. He's got a long recovery ahead, but Torres smiled slightly. You gave him that chance. Over the next week, Sarah watched her own recovery mirror Marcus's through the daily reports. Her incision healed cleanly, his body continued to accept the new liver. But she was moved from recovery to the maternity ward for observation. He was transferred to a rehabilitation facility that specialized in post-transplant addiction recovery. Emma brought flowers and tearful thanks. Sarah accepted them with grace, but asked for no details about Marcus's new life. Some distances, she had learned, were healthier to maintain. The cost of her choice became clearer as the weeks passed. Her prestigious surgery schedule was reassigned. Her research projects were put on hold. Her carefully planned maternity leave had to be restructured around her own recovery. But there were unexpected gains too. The enforced rest gave her time to prepare for her daughter's arrival in ways her busy schedule never would have allowed. David transformed their home office into a temporary bedroom, complete with a hospital-grade monitoring system, so she could stay connected to her practice even while confined to bed. 1 month after the surgery, as Sarah reviewed patient files from her bed, David brought her a letter. She recognized Marcus's handwriting on the envelope, but didn't open it immediately. He wrote it in his first week of rehab, David said. Emma dropped it off. Sarah set it aside. I'll read it someday, when it matters less. David sat on the edge of the bed, resting his hand on her now larger belly. You know what I think? I think you didn't just save his life. You saved the person you were 5 years ago, the one who believed in second chances, and maybe that was the real surgery you performed that day. Sarah smiled, feeling their daughter kick against David's palm. The incision scar on her abdomen pulled slightly with the movement, a permanent reminder of the choice she'd made. But scars, she had learned, could be marks of healing as much as hurt. Page from the NICU, David said, checking his phone. Duty calls. Go, she said. Save some lives. I'll be here growing hours. After he left, Sarah picked up Marcus's letter. She didn't open it, but she didn't throw it away either. Instead, she placed it in the memory box she was creating for her daughter alongside a pair of tiny ballet shoes she'd kept for 5 years, waiting for the right moment to let them mean something new. Outside her window, the sun was setting on another day at Metro General, where life and death and second chances danced their eternal dance. Somewhere in a rehab facility, Marcus was learning to live with his second chance. And here, in this quiet room, Sarah rested her hands on her belly, feeling the future move beneath them, whole, healed, and full of hope. Sarah gazed down at Emma, marveling at how her daughter's tiny fingers wrapped perfectly around her thumb. The soft afternoon light filtering through the nursery window cast a gentle glow on the 3-month-old's peaceful face. It seemed impossible that something so pure could emerge from such darkness, yet here she was living proof that beauty could bloom even in life's harshest seasons. The birth hadn't been easy. Complications had forced an emergency C-section, but the moment they placed Emma in her arms, Sarah knew every struggle had been worth it. She'd chosen the name for its meaning, whole or universal, because this little one had made her feel complete again. Across town, Marcus sat in his therapist's office, his 6-month sobriety chip catching the light as he fidgeted with it. I almost skipped today, he admitted. The dreams came back last night, the accident, the screaming, all of it. Dr. Chen nodded encouragingly. But you came anyway. That's growth, Marcus. I keep thinking about what Sarah said at the hearing, he continued, his voice thick with emotion, about choosing to forgive me so she could heal. I didn't deserve that mercy, but it changed everything. I wake up every morning now and ask myself how I can honor that gift. He'd thrown himself into recovery, not just from alcohol, but from the anger and self-loathing that had fueled his addiction. 3 times a week, he spoke at high schools about the consequences of drunk driving. Every Sunday, he led a support group for others struggling with guilt and grief. Small steps toward redemption, but steps nonetheless. Their paths crossed unexpectedly 6 months after Emma's birth. Sarah was leaving the pediatrician's office as Marcus finished his volunteer shift in the hospital's addiction counseling center. For a moment, they both froze, the weight of their shared history hanging between them. Then Emma cooed, breaking the tension. Marcus's eyes softened at the sight of the baby, and Sarah found herself offering a small but genuine smile. "She's beautiful," Marcus said softly. "I hope she grows up to have your capacity for compassion."
Sarah adjusted Emma in her arms. "I hope she grows up understanding that people can change," she replied, "that the hardest choices often lead to the most healing." They didn't speak long, just enough to acknowledge how far they both come. As Sarah watched Marcus walk away, Emma nestled against her chest. She reflected on how forgiveness had freed not just him, but her as well. The anger she'd once carried had made her world small and dark. Letting it go had opened space for joy, for love, for the precious bundle in her arms. Sometimes the bravest thing wasn't holding on to pain, but having the courage to release it.